Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Friday night. Our guest speaker tonight is Greg Gaetzman from Northern Wisconsin. Take it away, Greg.
Greetings and a pleasant Sabbath to all of you. We're only 17 days away from the Passover and the beginning of God's spring festival season of this 2023. Hopefully all of us have been doing some self-examination as we prepare to take the Passover. Not that we're worthy of it, but we need to be examining ourselves because God requires growth out of us. We know that the holy days that we keep are not Jewish holy days, rather they're the feasts of the eternal. And all of the feasts of the eternal picture or are symbolic of how God's plan of salvation for mankind is going to play out, and the meaning of it and the chronological order of it. But Leviticus 23 is not the only part of the Bible which pictures the plan of God's salvation. There are 5 other books that do the same thing, and they're called the Festival Scrolls. Now, I have a little chart here, but it has the inspired order of the Bible, and there are 3 divisions initially up until the time of Christ. You had the first division was the law. The second division were the prophets, and the third division were the writings. And the reason we know that is if you turn to Luke chapter 24, and we'll read what Jesus Christ said about this division of the Bible. A few days after Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, Jesus appeared to the 11 disciples. There's 11 at this time because Judas had hung himself. And Luke 24 and verse 37, but they were terrified and afraid and supposed that they had seen a spirit. And then Christ shows himself to them. And in verse 44, Christ said unto them, these are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, number 1, number 2 in the prophets in the division, and number 3 in the Psalms or the writings, in that order. And up until this time, that's all there were. Because we know after, when the disciples started to write, we had the 4th division of the Gospel in Acts. The 5th division was the general epistles. The 6th division was Paul's writings, the 14 epistles that he wrote. And the 7th division was the revelation of Jesus Christ that was written by John. But up until this point, there were only 3 divisions. And within this 3rd division of the writings, you have Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. But then you have the festival scrolls, Song of Psalms, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And the plan of God is played out in these festival scrolls also. So these 5 books are found in the writings division, and they tell us a story, and each one builds upon another in the order of how God's plan of salvation is going to work out. And this is all leading up to what I'm going to talk about. But number 1, the Song of Songs. It's read around the Passover season by the Jewish people. And symbolically, it shows a relationship about how the church will prepare to marry Jesus Christ. It's a love story, symbolic of the relationship between Jesus Christ and the church. And then you have the book of Ruth, which is read on the Feast of Weeks or around Pentecost. And it's symbolic of the harvest of the first fruits and the marriage to Jesus Christ. Then you have the 3rd book, Lamentations, read on the 9th and 10th day of the month of Av, A-V, which is the 6th month in the Jewish calendar. And it corresponds to late July, early August on the Roman calendar, the one we follow. Symbolically, this book pictures the great tribulation that will come upon the earth prior to the return of Jesus Christ. That's why they call it Lamentations. Incidentally, just as an aside, both the temples in Jerusalem were destroyed on the 9th of Av, late July, early August. 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem and took the Jews captive. And in 70 AD, on the same day, the second temple was destroyed. And that all took place late July, early August. Both destructions brought about great tribulation and lamenting to the Jewish people. And when the great tribulation comes to the earth, there's going to be great lamenting. Across the whole earth of the 8 billion people, you're going to have billions and billions and billions of people die in a very short period of time. And then the fourth book is Ecclesiastes, and it's read by the Jews at the Feast of Tabernacles time of year. And the emphasis is on physical abundance and peace and prosperity that will come because of obedience to the laws, statutes, and judgments of God that'll be taught by Jesus Christ and the 144,000 that are changed into spirit, ruling under Jesus Christ in the millennium. So that's the fourth book. Now, the fifth book of the Festival Scrolls is Esther. But where does Esther fit into this chronological order of how the plan of God is going to play out? As you're going to see, the book of Esther is about God's intervention in the salvation of Israel. It starts in the millennium, where God brings Israel back. But we also know in Ezekiel 37, in the second resurrection, after the 1,000 years, that Israel, all of Israel will be brought back, even the ones that are in their grave. They'll come up in the second resurrection. So with that as a short summary of the Festival Scrolls, the book of Esther is what I want to talk about today, because a week and a half ago, March 6th, 11 days ago, was the Feast of Purim. Now, we don't keep the Feast of Purim. It's not commanded by God, but it is one of the Festival Scrolls, and it's about what the events that took place in while the Jews were in captivity. It was a joyous celebration commemorating a time over 2,500 years ago when God intervened to save the Jewish nation from total annihilation. And just as God intervened historically, he will do so again in the future. So I'm not going to give all the historical background as to what led up to the events of the book of Esther. There's all kinds of battles and time gaps, etc. If anybody's interested, I could show that to them. But there are valuable lessons in this book that we can apply to our life. We can have the confidence that just as God intervened to save his covenant people, he will do the same for his spiritual covenant people. And when each and every one of us was baptized, we made a covenant with God. And in the end of the age, God is going to save his covenant people. He's faithful. There's a Hebrew word called hesed, H-E-S-E-D, and it's covenant loyalty, covenant love. And God always keeps his part of the bargain. And because we have made a covenant with God at our baptism, we are assured that just as he saved physical Israel, he will intervene on our behalf. So if you turn to Esther, if you would please, the book of Esther. So Esther is the only book in all of the Bible that does not specifically mention the name of God, but his guiding and protective hand is there throughout the whole book. This is a story about the ancient Jews after the rise of the Persians to power. They had taken over control. They had beaten the Babylonians, and they were now in control. The events of this book are important because in the plan of God, because if God had not intervened, the Jewish nation that was still in captivity would have perished, and the plan of God would have ended. So it was a very important thing. So Esther chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, if you follow along with me. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, and he's also known as Xerxes. I'm going to use that name, Xerxes the first. This is Xerxes, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. Now I've got a map here. You can't see it on there, but we're talking on the far eastern side from India all the way over to Ethiopia, and that includes the area of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, all the way up to Greece in the upper western portion of it. A huge, huge piece of land. And this is where Xerxes is reigning over. Verse 2, then in those days when King Xerxes sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan in the palace, which right now today is Western Iran. And we've heard a lot about Iran and how they feel about the Jews. So in verses 3 and 4 here, in the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. In verse 4, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So he threw a feast for these people for 6 months. And 180 days divided by 30, basically 6 months. He was planning to avenge the defeat of his father earlier to Greece in 480 BC, 490 BC. But he was wining and dining all the princes from 127 provinces over this huge span, immense span of land. And he was wining and dining them so that the military leaders would muster up and form an army that Xerxes could use to attack Greece. So all the ethnic contingencies of this vast empire, 127 provinces, he has all the big shots, all the leaders, all the military leaders there for 6 months, wining and dining them and hoping that they'll give their allegiance over to him, and then he can take this huge army and attack Greece. Verse 5, and when these 180 days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in the palace, Shushan the palace, but unto great and small 7 days. So another 7-day feast for the people of the palace. And, isn't that typical of leaders? They give a 6-month feast for themselves, but they give a 7-week or 7-day feast for the workers. Not much has changed. So typical, the working class that always does the work have the scraps off the table, basically. Verse 7 and 8. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse from one another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. The law never forced anybody to drink. If you didn't want to drink, you didn't have to, but I'm sure most of them did. None was compelled to drink, and you could drink according to every man's pleasure. And then in verse 9 through 12, also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Xerxes. So Vashti the queen is going to have a feast for basically her harem, or the harem that she ruled over. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, well, I guess so, when you're drinking for 7 days after 6 months of drinking, you're going to be merry with wine. He commanded Mehuman, there's 7 people here, to come before him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. So it's typical, they're drunk, and they're going to bring the queen because she was a beautiful woman, and he's going to parade his beautiful wife in front of all these people. Verse 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore, the king was very wroth, and his anger burned within him. So he's drunk and he's angry. So he counsels with his 7 princes, these 7 people that are mentioned up here in verse 10. Now, what he should have done is counsel with them before he commanded Vashti to come out and parade herself before all these people, but he didn't. So verses 15 and 16. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law, because she has not performed the commandment of the king Xerxes by the chamberlain? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen has not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. this huge expanse of land from India all the way over to Ethiopia. And he said, we've got a problem. The situation is very bad. So now in verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Medes and the Persians, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before the king, Xerxes, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So letters of Vashti's banishment are sent to the 127 provinces. Verses 20 to 22 now. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to the great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters to all the king's provinces, into every province according to the people and according to their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language. So there's a lesson to be learned here. We're looking about carnality here. But let's turn for the first lesson that really comes out of this in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7. Turn to 1 Peter 3 and verse 7. Keep your fingers here in Esther, and let's look at God's perspective as to how men need to be treating women, their wives especially. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as to the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So give honor unto your wife. Don't treat her as a male chauvinist. Don't treat her the way many women in the Middle East and around the world are treated. Show respect and dignity to her. Turn to Ephesians 5 and verse 17. And we'll see another very important aspect as far as a lesson that we need to be continually growing in this understanding. Ephesians 5 and verse 17. Wherefore, be you not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. So we're talking about, this is what God wants, how God wants men to be, husbands to be treating their wives. Verse 21. Submit yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Now, many times husbands will stop at verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. And then they stop there. Well, they need to continue reading on a bit further down, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself for it. So one of the lessons here, we're talking about how women have been treated down through the millennia with disrespect, little honor, but this is how God wants things to be done. And in the millennium, this is how marriages will be. The husband will give honor unto his wife and treat her with dignity and respect as being heirs together of the promise. So let's go back to Esther, chapter 2. While Xerxes is trying to gain support for his military endeavors against Greece, this action by Vashti greatly disrupted the leaders and the wining and dining of the various leaders of the kingdom. And that Vashti had to be banished to set an example, number one, to keep stability in the nation, in the empire, and number two, to promote Xerxes is an attempt to muster up an army. It was critical that this happened. Well, if Xerxes hadn't been drunk, maybe he wouldn't have done this to Vashti and she wouldn't have rebelled against him. So Esther chapter 2, first 4 verses. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus or Xerxes was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants and ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, now this is in Iran, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. and let the things for purification be given unto them. And let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So for 12 months, there's this purification process. And Esther is part of this group of women, part of, well, basically Xerxes' harem. Now God's intervention begins, but his name is not mentioned. Esther 2, verses 5 and 6. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with a captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Well, Mordecai is fairly old because Jerusalem was sacked in 597 BC. And the book of Esther is being talked about in 486 BC. You're talking about a long, long period of time. Now, whether this is referring to the sons that were carried away and possibly Mordecai was a son of one of those people, we don't know. But the bottom line is Mordecai is an older man. Verse 7 and 8. And he brought up Hadassah, that's her Jewish, or Myrtle is her Jewish name, that is Esther, her Persian name, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughters. So he raised her. And just as God brought Joseph into Pharaoh's house back in Genesis chapter 39, he's now bringing Esther into Xerxes' palace, all for the purpose of protecting his covenant people. The Jews were a captive people surrounded by Gentiles with anti-Semitic beliefs, much like we see today in the Middle East, but much greater. So in verse 9 of chapter 2, and the maiden, Esther, pleased Haggai, the keeper of the women, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for her purification, which such things belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given, basically servants to her, given to her out of the king's house. And he, Haggai, preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So there was something special about Esther that caused the keeper of the women, Haggai, to take notice. And we'll see later what some of those traits were. In verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not do it. In other words, don't tell the people that you're part of the Jewish population. Esther didn't parade her religion around. She didn't parade her nationality around. She was graceful. She was tactful. She had wisdom. She was not outspoken. She thought before she opened her mouth. She didn't draw attention to herself. She was a fairly meek person. Verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house. In other words, this is the woman that he basically raised. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther was doing and what should become of her. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go into the king, Xerxes, after she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. So basically, there were 12 months of massaging, beauty treatments, scented oils, cucumber patches, body wraps, you name it. The selection process was beginning because they had to be absolutely beautiful because the king was going to choose one of them to be a replacement queen for Vashti. And then we read in verse 15, go forward just a bit. Now, when the turn of Esther came, the daughter of Abihail, Esther's father, Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So now she becomes queen of Persia. So there's another lesson here that can be taken out of this. Turn to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18. Keep your finger here in Esther chapter 2. But turn to 2 Peter 3 and verse 18. 2 Peter 3 and verse 18. It says, but grow in the grace and the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him glory both now and forever. Amen. So the Greek word grace is number 5485. And it's charis, charis, and it's where we get the word charisma, in the English word charisma. Now, Thayer's definition says it means to afford joy or pleasure, delight, charm, especially in the divine influence of the heart. And in Strong's Concordance, the same number, 5485, it's a manner of acting, especially the divine influence upon the heart and its reflection in life. So in other words, growing in the grace of Jesus Christ, we're taking on the very character of Jesus Christ, who was incredibly graceful. People loved being around him. He didn't turn people off. He was tactful, and people wanted to be around him. And, it says we're to grow in not just the knowledge of Jesus Christ about him, but in his character. So another lesson there. Back to Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. So Esther was taken into the king, into his house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth. And in the Roman calendar, that's January. In the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set her royal crown upon her. So she's made, a queen of Persia. So we are being groomed right now. The covenant people of God, those that have made a baptismal covenant with God, are being groomed and shaped to be a bride for a king. Does our lifestyle reflect that of a bride to Jesus Christ? Turn to Revelation, keep your fingers here. Turn to Revelation 19, and we'll read verses 7 to 9. Revelation 19. And we'll read verses 7 to 9. Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen and white, for the linen is the righteousness of the saints. And he said unto me, John, that is, right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said unto me, these are the true sayings of God. So here we are. We also are being groomed to be a bride for a king. That's why we're to grow in not just the knowledge of Christ, but in the grace, how he acted, how he felt about things, how he treated people, what came out of his mouth. Now you can put cross references here of Proverbs 31 verses 10 to 31, Proverbs 31 verses 10 to 31, the Proverbs 31 woman. She's an incredibly talented woman, but she's a graceful woman. And or you can look in Titus chapter 2, how the older men, the older women are to teach the young men and teach the young women and the children how to be members of a successful family, not a broken family. And there's many other places we could turn to, but you can just use those as cross references. So the question we have to ask ourselves now, as we're in this pre-Passover self-examination period of time, are we preparing ourselves to be married to a king? And it's a good question, because judgment is now upon the church. So back to Esther, chapter 2. Esther, chapter 2, And we'll read verses 21 to 23. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. There was an assassination attempt being plotted out here. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So the story continues. Mordecai receives credit for revealing the plot to kill King Xerxes. And it's written in the book of the Chronicles of the King, chapter 3, verse 1. After these things did King Xerxes promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were in him. So there's background to this. He is the descendant of Esau. And we know the troubles that Esau gave to Israel. So you can put in your margins here, and you can look it up later. Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 to 19. Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 to 19. And Exodus 17, verses 14 to 16. Exodus 17, verses 14 to 16. And it talks about what took place with Esau and why, and the descendants of Esau. And Haman is an Amalekite of the house of Esau. So Haman is one of a long line of descendants of Esau who have hated God's people down through the centuries and the millennia, and they've wanted to destroy them. So Esther chapter 3 and verse 2, and the king and all the servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did give reverence unto Haman. So Haman wanted adoration. He was very pompous. He was arrogant. He was filled with pride. Sounds like the description that we see in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 of Hillel. That's the Hebrew name for Satan. Satan is his Greek name. Lucifer is his Latin name. But Hillel was his name when he was created and perfect by God. But he was filled with pride and arrogance. So Haman despised Mordecai and developed a plan to kill Mordecai and all the Jews. Esther chapter 3, verses 3 to 6. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's commandment? In other words, why don't you bow down? Now it came to pass when they spoke daily unto Mordecai, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not down, nor did reverence, then Haman was full of wrath. In verse 6, and he, Haman, thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, even the people of Mordecai, all the Jews. So now his wrath is to the point where he's going to get rid of not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. Haman is filled with anger, and it continues to grow year after year. So Esther chapter 3, Haman begins to act upon this plot, and he comes to Xerxes. Esther chapter 3, verses 7 to 10. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast that is the lot, before Haman, from day to day. Every day they cast a lot. And from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. In verse 8, and Haman said unto King Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people of all the provinces of your kingdom, these 127 provinces. And their laws are diverse from all the people. They neither keep the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to tolerate them. Verse 9, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents, we're talking millions of dollars in today's money, of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasury. And the king took his ring, his signet, from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, descendant from Esau, the Jews' enemy. So just as Hitler had the final solution for the Jews in Europe, Haman had the final solution for the Jews of Persia: kill all the Jews. And they cast lots to determine when this was going to happen. So a year passed, and they came to the 12th month. And Xerxes didn't even ask who the people were. He just had trust in Haman. So Haman spins his lies to Xerxes, and it will cost the king nothing to get rid of all these people. They'll take all the possessions from the Jews, just as Hitler took all the possessions from the Jews and gave them to the Nazis to increase their wealth. Esther 3 and verse 11. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to you, the people also to do with them as it seems good to you. Verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, Nisan, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, his governors that were in every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, because there are different languages throughout this huge span of land. In the name of King Xerxes was it written and sealed with the king's ring, in other words, his signet. And the letters were sent by post unto all the provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all the Jews, both young and old, little and old, women, in one day, even on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, in our Roman calendar, that's March, and to take spoil of them for a prey. This is one day before the Passover. Now, here's another lesson here. This is who is behind all of this insanity. We know in John chapter 10 and verse 10, John 10 and verse 10, it says, the thief comes not but for to steal, to kill, and destroy. And ultimately, the thief is Satan, who's trying to steal people away from God. But that's where the motivation for Haman is coming from Satan, the devil. They're going to have all the Jews destroyed and cause them to perish. Now, just again, as an aside, it's interesting to note that on this very same day in the Hebrew calendar, April 2nd, 2015, the U.S. gave Iran $150 billion so they would have the capability of developing a nuclear program under Barack Obama. The head of the Ministry of the Defense for Iran said he had two goals before he died. Number one was to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And number two, then to turn towards big Satan, America. On the very self-same day, thousands of years later, we give $150 billion to Iran to develop the very capability to destroy all the Jews. I thought that was more than just a coincidence. Esther chapter 4, first 3 verses. And when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud, bitter cry. Verse 2, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, wheresoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Mordecai and the entire Jewish nation are beseeching mercy and deliverance. But it doesn't say who they're praying to. God's name is not mentioned here, but it's obvious they're looking to someone for help. Chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. So Esther's maid and her chamberlains came and told her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothes to Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. He turned it down. In verse 5, then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and what he was doing. Esther wants to know why Mordecai is acting this way. Verses 6 to 12. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasury for the Jews to destroy them. And also he, Hatach, gave him, Mordecai, a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go into the king, Xerxes, to make supplication unto him, and to make requests before him for the people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spoke unto Hatach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. Verse 11, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces do know that whatsoever man or woman shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law, that he be put to death. So if you come into the king where he is sitting and you're not requested by the king to come in there, you get the axe. Verse 12, and they told the words of to Mordecai of Esther. So in other words, he's saying, I can't go in there. He hasn't requested me. So if the king didn't call for you, you couldn't go in there and you could be killed. Now, let's learn another lesson here. That's man's approach to leadership. Turn to Hebrews 4 and verse 6. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 6. Let's notice God's will. Hebrews 4 and verse 16, I'm sorry. Hebrews 4 and verse 16. I misquoted that. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace in time of need. Remember, God sits on what is called the mercy seat. So nobody could go into King Xerxes for fear of being beheaded. But God says to his people, come to me. He welcomes people to come to him in prayer. And because we have made a covenant with God at baptism, we're part of the covenant people, just as the Jews were part of the covenant people. And that's where that word hesed, H-E-S-E-D, covenant love comes in. God always keeps his part of a covenant. So go back to Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. For if you altogether hold your peace, this is Mordecai talking to Esther, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether thou art come unto this kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai, in essence, says someone is going to leak the truth that Esther is also a Jew. So the lesson here, and this is playing out, this has all been planned by God. Just as God set up Joseph, whom his brothers hated and arranged back in Genesis 37 for his captivity, he eventually became second in command in Egypt for the saving of the Israelites. So too, Esther is being used by God to save the Jews. Esther 4, verses 15 to 17. Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer: go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat or drink 3 days, and day or night. Also, I and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So divine providence here. Again, God is not mentioned. But who or what taught them to fast and why to fast? Esther chapter 5, verses 1 to 2. Now it came to pass in the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his eyes, in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter. In other words, he beckoned her in. That was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the golden scepter. So Esther understood the rules of the court. She just didn't barge in there, without an invite. Verses 3-5. Then said the king unto Esther, why are you here? And what is your request? And it shall be given unto you unto half the kingdom. This guy made some incredible promises. And Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. So Esther's preparing a banquet for Haman, and she invites Xerxes to come along. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do to Esther as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Esther used wisdom and tact to set the stage for the deliverance of her people. Did the plan come from God? I would think yes. She fasted 3 days and 3 nights, and very possibly God put the idea into her head. In verse 6, and the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is your petition? And it shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of the kingdom. So here's his banquet: wine, pheasant, quail, everything, to satisfy these 2 individuals. A real feast. In verses 7 and 8. Then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is this: if I have found favor in your sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to a banquet that I shall prepare for them. This is a second banquet. And I will do tomorrow as the king has said. So verses 9 and 10. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. He's going to be honored. And he must just be busting with pride. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. Haman hated Mordecai. He had grown, hatred had grown over the years. Turn to Proverbs 16 and verse 18. Keep your finger here. But Proverbs 16 and verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. And you can put in your margin there, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. It basically says the same thing. So again, God is now entering the picture here. Esther 5, verse 11. And when Haman told them, his friends and Zeresh his wife, of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above all the princes and servants in the kingdom. I mean, his ego must have just been bursting. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. This anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic attitude and hatred for Mordecai has grown over the years. Then Zeresh, his wife, said, and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow, and speak unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the king pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. So his pride, his ego, his arrogance are in play, and they build the very gallows that he himself is going to be hanged on. Again, God intervened in behind the scenes events, but his name is not mentioned. Esther chapter 6 and verse 1. And that night could not the king sleep. And he commanded, he's restless, he's tossing back and forth. So he commanded that the book of the Chronicles of the king, and they were read before the king. So he can't sleep. So this is the turning point in the book for the Jews. We know earlier in Esther 2 and verse 23 that the assassination plot was revealed to Xerxes, and it was entered into the Chronicles of the king. Now Xerxes is reading about this in verse 2 and 3. And if it were found written that Mordecai, and it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the kings of the door, who had sought to lay hand on King Xerxes. And the king said, "What honor and dignity has been done unto Mordecai for this?" And then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, "For there is nothing done to him." So the next morning, in walks Haman, still filled with his arrogance and his joy and his pride. Verses 4 to 9. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman was to come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, "Behold, Haman stands in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, "What shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let him take the royal garment," verse 8, "which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides, and the crown which is set upon the king's head, and let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback all through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." So Haman is about to be greatly humbled because he thinks it's him. Verse 10. Then the king said unto Haman, "Make haste and take apparel, and do so to Mordecai the Jew." Haman's mouth must have just dropped open. And he had to, in verse 11, he had to take Haman around through the city, dressed in the king's apparel and with the crown on the horse, and he had to parade him around through the city. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house. He basically went running home to mama. And Haman told Zeresh, verse 13, his wife, all his friends, everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men, and Zeresh, his wife, unto him, "Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom you have begun to fall. Thou shalt not prevail against him, but you shall surely fall before him." So now he's in trouble, and he knows it. So Haman had to be absolutely shocked as to what was happening here. The plan of God is beginning to play out. Chapter 7, the noose is about to tighten around Haman. Verse 1 of chapter 7, so the king Haman came to the queen, to the banquet which Esther the queen had made. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, "What is your petition, Esther? And it shall be granted you." Then Esther, verse 3, said, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my request, and my people at my request. For if we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be slain and perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Verse 5, then the king answered Esther and said, "Who is he and where is he that does presume in his heart to kill you and your people?" Now the hammer drops. And Esther said in verse 6, the adversary and the enemy is that wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid. You think so? Before the king and the queen. He must have been terrified. And the king, arising from a banquet of wine in his wrath, now he's angry, he went out to the palace garden. And Haman stood up and ran over to Esther, for he saw that the evil that was determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden after he had probably calmed down into the palace of the banquet of wine. And Haman had fallen upon the bed. Esther's probably laying on a couch, and he jumps, on the couch, pleading for his life. Then the king said, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits, which Haman has made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, stands in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that had been prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Hold your finger here. Another lesson. Turn to Romans 11, verse 33. Romans 11, verse 33. Oh, the depths and the riches both of wisdom and of knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Also turn to Psalms 94. Psalms 94, verses 21 to 23. They gather themselves together against the life of the righteous and condemn the innocent blood. But the eternal is my defense, and my rock, and my God is the rock of my refuge. And then also go back to Deuteronomy 32. And these are all promises that we can claim because we are God's covenant people. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 35. To me belongs vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that come upon them make haste. So you can cross-reference all of those, but basically God says in his wisdom that he will even the score. So no matter how tough our trials become, if we hold fast and if we remain faithful to our calling, God will intervene. And it also says, and you can put down 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. I'll read it to you, but you can just cross-reference it. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. There is no temptation taken you, but such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. That's a promise from God, who is faithful. So, these are difficult times that we're living in, and they're going to get more difficult. And technically, we look more like Jews than the Jews do because we actually observe these days. And the anti-Semitic beliefs around the world are growing, and there's hatred for the Jews, and that will be turned upon us someday. Esther chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. On that day did King Xerxes give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And verse 2, and the king took off his ring, his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Verses 3, I'll jump through this quickly. And Esther spoke again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief that Haman the Agagite and his devices that he had devised against the Jews. So she's on her knees before the king, begging him, please cause his decree to be turned backward. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. And he said, if it please the king, if I have found favor in your sight, the thing seemed right before the king. And if I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, in other words, descendants of Esau, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are all in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see all the evil that shall come upon my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So then basically what happens is that Xerxes reverses the decision, and he has Mordecai write another decree. And that decree is sent out to all the provinces. And you'll notice down in verse 9, unto all the provinces which are in India, unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, in every language according to the language of those people. In verse 10, and he wrote in the king Xerxes' name, this is Mordecai, and sealed with the king's ring, the signet ring, and sent letters by posts on horseback and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. I'm not really sure what that is. Some type of a four-legged animal. In verse 11, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and provinces that would assault them, both little and great, and the women, and to take spoil from them. So basically, the Jews are now permitted to defend themselves against the murderous decree that Haman had issued against them. Verse 12 and 13, upon one day in all the provinces of King Xerxes, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, that's when this would happen. Copy of the writing of the commandment was to be given, and every province was published. The Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves of their people. So a decree is written saying on the very day of the 12th month of Adar, when the Jews were to be killed, that the Jews will now have the right to stand up to defend themselves and shall have the support of the governors and the princes of the 127 provinces to cause to perish to all who sought to kill the Jews. A powerful turn of events. Esther chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the king's commandment, the execution drew near. In the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over the Jews, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes to lay hand on such as sought to hurt them. No man could withstand them, for the fear all fell upon all the people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the kings, verse 3, helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. So Mordecai is now prime minister. And in that day, in a day of darkness, had it not been for God's intervention by using Esther and Mordecai, the Jews would have been destroyed, but now they found deliverance. Verses 5 and 6. And in Shushan the palace, the Jews were destroyed 500 men. 500 men are killed in the palace that hated the Jews, hated Mordecai. In verse 12, and the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? And it shall be granted unto you. And then Esther says in verse 13, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in the Shushan to do tomorrow also according to this day degree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. So Haman's 10 sons are also hanged. And then we go down to verse 16. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and the rest from their enemies and slew of the foes, these anti-Semitic Jew haters, 75,000. So 75,000 Jew haters are killed. And, there's more than that today. But we see in verse 17 to 21 here, on the 13th day of the month Adar, on the 14th day of the same day, there was a feasting of gladness. And the Jews that were in Shushan, the palace, gathered together. And on the 13th and the 14th day, and on the 15th day, they made rest and made it a day of feasting and gladness. That's what the Feast of Purim is about. So basically, what is happening here is that because of God's intervention, the nation of Israel is saved from total annihilation. If that hadn't happened, the entire nation of Judah would have perished. The plan of God would have ended. So God intervenes. And, during this celebration, and again, this is not a commanded holy day of God, but it's one of the festival scrolls. And, it says in the Talmud, and I thought this was funny, that according to the Talmud, on Purim, one should drink until he can no longer tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought it was kind of funny that there's tremendous celebration. And that's what the Feast of Purim is all about. It was quite a celebration that took place. And then you go to the last chapter, chapter 10, only a few verses here. Chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. And King Xerxes laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. And all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Xerxes, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of the brethren, seeking and speaking peace to all his seed. So God brought a complete change of mind in a political decision in a huge empire. So drastic that it changed the entire course of history. And his name is not even mentioned in this book. Mordecai discovered two conspirators that had nothing to do with what was happening. And because he revealed it to Esther, and Esther took it to the king, it set in motion a course of events to save the Jewish nation thousands of years ago. Now, there's a lesson here for us. If God can do that to the Jews over 2,500 years ago, he can deliver the spiritual church in the end of the age. It's a good lesson to remember in these perilous times. So basically, a summary here. God's love for his covenant people is beyond our understanding. Hesed, H-E-S-E-D, is the Hebrew word for covenant love. And God always keeps his part of the bargain. Even when we fall short, even when we slip up, if we repent, God is always there to forgive. If he can do that for his covenant people thousands of years ago, he can do that for his spiritual nation in the end of the age. So it's consoling to know that as these times get more and more perilous, there are things happening in our land that are absolutely unbelievable. And we know anti-Semitic movements. I mean, even in our Congress, there are descendants of Esau that are calling for the destruction of Israel. And again, we're going to be found out to be more like Jews than they are. So it's a powerful book, and I thought it would be a good time to study it because the Feast of Purim actually took place a little over a week and a half ago, March 6th. So with that, we'll end. And if there's any questions, we'll try to answer them.
Okay, this is the part where you have a question or a comment you can make. All you have to do is raise your hand. Geigers.
Hey, good evening, and thank you, Greg. It's I don't mean to say you're a good storyteller, but you were a good storyteller. That really flowed very well. Even though it's an account most of us are very familiar with, it's still wonderful to look at it again and pick up all those inspiring pieces. I just had one comment to mention. What Haman was creating, there's a little debate on whether it was a gallows to hang him, or in fact, this was intended for impaling. And the words for gallows could go either way, And it's kind of curious that we know the word that is commonly translated cross is not, that's not really supportive of what that was either. It was
Right, it was more of a stake.
Yeah, more of a stake, and I don't know, but of course that was the ultimate in ignominy, to impale somebody. Horrific.
Whether it be a stake or a gallows to be hung on, it'd be an ugly
Right.
way to die.
Just a horrific way to die, and I think they were talking about quite a little bit of height on this, which with a gallows, okay, maybe for visibility, that's why you would have a higher gallows and a higher platform that they would hang from. But if this was in fact impaling, that would also be quite a horrific sight to see as well. So just for what it's worth, thank you for rehearsing it. It was well done. And it's interesting that Mordecai, as well as Esther, were from the tribe of Benjamin, which was considered the house of Judah, but in fact weren't really of the tribe of. So just trivia. But thank you. Appreciate what you did.
Oh, and Vicky says to say hi to you and Scarlett.
Well, yeah, we can say hi to Vicky as well. Right back.
All right.
Okay. Carolyn?
Oh, Greg, thank you so much for this evening. I have been doing a Bible study that someone had recommended to me. And ironically, I just went through March 5th and 6th, a part of this Esther story. And my question was, is this something that we should be observing? But then I read in the scriptures, of course, that this was established among the Jews, that they should keep the 14th day. And I thought, how interesting that you brought this all to us this evening. And thank you so much.
But it was kind of like our 4th of July. We celebrate our 4th of July as independence from England. And it was just a national holiday. It's not one of the commanded feasts of the eternal that we find in Leviticus 23, but it is in the scriptures, and it's called one of the festival books. And it portrays the salvation of the Jews and what's going to happen at the start of the millennium, as well as at the start of the second resurrection after the 1,000 years. So it's.
Yes, well, it was interesting that this is, as it's written in the scriptures, with verses 20 through 22. So this was established, these things that they would keep them the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month yearly. But again, this was for the Jews and not
Right.
a godly. Yes, that was.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you again.
John, I'm assuming it's John Herman.
Yeah, that's me. Well, just one little thing. couple of weeks ago, I was studying into the tribe of Benjamin. A little aside here, it's interesting though. I looked it up and finally found some Bible maps on who got what territory, because somewhere in there it says, you know, where everybody's territory was. The city of Jerusalem was actually where the tribe of Benjamin was. Of course, that was all over by the time of the New Testament, you know. I just thought that was interesting that it wasn't in where Judea was exactly at the time. It was in the tribe of Benjamin's territory.
Okay. Tagore.
Yeah, this was a nice recap of whole book of Esther. What an absolute power these kings enjoyed. That's insane. And anybody approaches them without invitation, they will just be beheaded.
Yeah.
And what a bloody times they were. And you're giving good scriptures to back up what is happening behind the scenes. This came to my mind, Proverbs 26, verse 27. Whosoever digs a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him. It looks, this happened to Haman.
You know, it's in Deuteronomy, there's a law, and we know in the millennium, the laws, statutes, and judgments are going to be taught. But in Deuteronomy, it says, if one person comes and lies about another person, hoping they'll get a punishment, if that person is found to be a liar, the punishment that he wished will come upon him. So if A lies about B, and A is found to be a liar, that punishment goes back onto A. God is very fair and very just. And these, and that's why it behooves us in our preparation to be kings and priests that, you know, that we at least become familiar with the laws, statutes, and judgments, because it's what's going to be taught in the millennium for 1,000 years and beyond, I'm sure. But yeah, God is incredibly fair.
Where is that in Deuteronomy, Greg? Do you
I think
remember?
it's Deuteronomy 25. Let me look it up. No, I'm not falling upon it right now. I'll look it
Okay,
up.
that's all right. I'll find it.
Tigers?
Yeah, I was just noticing, it's clear that Haman not only hated Mordecai, he wanted to silence him. And I was just wondering if that would be called an gag order. Just curious.
It's a word play, I guess.
There's been some mention about some of the presentations, past presentation that Greg has given. I've got in the chat room, I've got a link, hopefully that's correct, to our YouTube page. We have all of our presentations posted. And thanks to the hard work of Peggy and Anna, they made playlists so you can actually go right to the person you want to hear. Alan?
Oh, yeah, I heard a commentator talking on talk radio. And he said that they believe this Agagite, Haman, is a descendant of Agag, the king Agag, that Samuel had to kill in front of Saul because Saul did not do it. So this King Agag, who was hacked, it says, by Samuel, is one of the forefathers of this Agagite, which I found to be an interesting connection. This is one of the reasons they had such animosity, because of what they had, what Israel had done to them, including the hacking of the king Agag. But and, you know, today, Greg, as you were reading through, I was following the years, and in the past, I would always think of the book of Esther as having taken place in a very short period of time. But no, in the first chapter, verse 3, it's the 3rd year of the king. In chapter 2:16, it's the 7th year of the king. And in chapter 3, verse 7, it's the 12th year of the king. So this process to bring Esther into her queenship in the beginning was begun in the 3rd year. And this conflict arises in the 12th year. So now she's been queen for 9 years. And I never really thought that through in that way until today when you read the whole account.
Well, and that was part that I didn't want to get into, but there's a time gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2.
Yeah.
Where he takes, Xerxes takes his army that he has mustered up, and he goes to fight up against the army of Greece, and he's defeated. So there's a time gap there.
Yeah.
And yes, it doesn't happen all in a year's time. There are time gaps that take place down through the book.
Yeah, so by the time we get to chapter 3, verse 7, we're in the 12th year.
Yeah.
So Esther has already been an experienced queen for at least a few years, if not
Right.
up to maybe 9 years. Which
I agree.
kind of like, I was a little surprised to notice that. Now, there is something else I'd like to say about the history of this. This happened, this whole event of finding a new queen and installing her, and then having this thing with with Haman. This all occurred in between the first return of Zerubbabel and the second return under Ezra. So this is all taking place during the restoration period, which
Yep.
I find to be very interesting, because if we could briefly just turn over to Ezra, the book of Ezra, chapter 4, we're going to see the same king mentioned.
Yep.
Now here it calls him Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes. This is in Ezra 4:6. Now in the reign of Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, which we saw in the book of Esther there, they wrote accusations against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. These were the people who were coming up against Zerubbabel, if you read from the beginning of the chapter. So the first return is trying to build the new temple.
Right.
And this resisting clan of people are coming up against them building the temple, claiming, well, you're just going to try to rebel against the king. That's why you're doing this. So the accusers are coming, and Haman also would have been an accuser. So this accusation is coming from different angles. So in Ezra 4:6, it's the same king, Xerxes. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Artaxerxes, also, all these other men wrote to the king of Persia. And so you see, there's this continuation of resistance against them. It wasn't just Haman that had this hatred. It was a variety of sources that were combating the progress that was being made during the restoration period. So I think we can take this as a parallel. When we are being restored, there are many resistance, there's many enemies to restoration. I realize it's a very complex matter. And you all know that in your own lives, when you have been in a process of restoration personally, there is much resistance against you being restored also. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, it does say in the book of Acts, through much tribulation shall you enter the kingdom of God. And that's true. But and as far as all these dates, I had all of that in the message, but I cut it out because I wanted to get to the lessons that we could learn out of the book. But yes, there are time gaps in there. And actually, part of the image of Daniel chapter 2 took place because we know the head of gold, the arms of silver, the brass, and thighs of, or the brass of the thighs is Greece. So what had to happen, we had to go from Nebuchadnezzar, and they had to be replaced by the Persians. And then it was time for the Persians to be replaced by Alexander the Great. Now, that's a mouthful, but that all was taking place during this period of time. But I left all of that out because it took away from the lessons that I wanted to get. I mean, there's only so much time that you can give in this. But you can see God fulfilling prophecy in so many ways. And
If you tried to add in all the historical aspects, you would not be able to get through the material. But
exactly.
Thank you for laboring anyway. It's well worth listening.
Okay.